Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about motivation, stress, and emotion. What I'd like to do here first is for you all to sit quietly for just a moment, close your eyes, and think about the future. What comes to mind first? How long does it take you to see that future? For most of you, it'll only take a couple of seconds, and probably what you're thinking about is something that you'd like to happen. Some conclusion to a goal, some focus of your own future. Goals capture our attention from the time we wake up to the time we go to sleep at night. For example, why do you think people go to college? Why are you taking this course, for example? Each of those different reasons that some of you might have are goal-oriented, typically, and can reflect the diversity and singularity of human motivation, where some of you have these intrinsic motivations to understand this piece, some of you have extrinsic motivations that are focused on getting a particular grade or going to a particular school. Some of you have all of those combined. Motivation is a really complex subject, and you'll see as we talk about it today that it builds on a lot of the content that we've already talked about, things like learning and behavior, cognition, and other areas of the course. What I'd like to do today primarily is to focus on stress. You really should understand the different theories of emotion that are presented in your text, but this is an area worth a bit more of an in-depth discussion, and I feel like the text is sort of lean on this area, so I wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about stress. Not just because it's an important concept in psychology, but my anecdotal understanding of the world is that stress has become sort of a social currency. We all talk about how stressed out we are, but I don't think that we really even understand what that means entirely. Is it that we have so many goals with so many tasks that we are so motivated, extrinsically and intrinsically, towards so many conflicting demands that we just don't have the resources to meet those needs? Or is it something else? So let's attempt to understand stress from a scientific perspective. So first, it's important to understand what stress is. Now, there's often a bit of confusion about this because scientists and lay people use the term really commonly, and it has very different meanings. Now, so stress, from its very basic definition, is the non-specific demand on the body or mind. Now, that's a little vague and jargony. What that means is that anything from the outside world that forces a response from you is technically a stressor. That's a stress. However, what we really mean most of the time when we're talking about stress is our body's response and our mind's response to those demands. So we have the stressor and the stress response, and both of those things combine to create what we talk about as stress. Now, it's important to understand that stress is adaptive. Demands outside of our body encourage a response that activates our sympathetic nervous system, which you remember from the biological chapter, prepares us to act, right? Prepares us to move, prepares us to cope with those demands on our body or mind. It slows our digestion, it increases the amount of blood flow that's going to our extremities so that we can move more quickly. It dilates our pupils so that we can see better, particularly in low light situations. So stress and this stress response is really important in situations where, like this gentleman here, we might really need our body to respond quickly. However, stress doesn't have to be a bad thing. We talk about how this is a non-specific demand because even good things produce demands on the body. For example, this gentleman we just talked about is in distress, probably. Not only is there a non-specific demand on his body, well in this case a rather specific demand on his body, but it's a negatively valenced response. It's a bad situation where he doesn't probably feel like he has the resources to overcome that stressor. In this picture over here, we have what we might call eustress. Eustress is a positive demand, something that we recognize is good, that we have the resources to meet the demands of that challenge, and that we might experience positive things from. So stress can be both of these things, and even too much eustress can cause some physiological problems we'll talk about in just a minute. So far, we've been talking about stress like we were 1950s behaviorists. Like there's some demand on the body, and then there's a response to that demand, and there's nothing in between. But we recognize through our chapters on cognition and learning that it's more than just a stimulus and response. Instead, the way that we think about the stressor and the way that we feel about the stressor is really critical to the way that we respond, even the way that our bodies respond in the moment. The way that we're thinking about that stressor, the way that we're appraising that stressor, produces a different response. We call this the process of appraisal, where you take something that's happening in the world and you make a judgment about that thing. We're going to talk more about the process of appraisals in the social psychology unit, but we can think about whether demand is appraised in one of two different ways. So we have this stressful event. In this example, it's a long and difficult math test. Now that event sort of goes into our minds, and we can appraise that event in one of two different ways. We'll start down here. We can appraise this event as a challenge. That is, I have all the resources I need. I do have to leverage all of those resources in order to do well. It's difficult, it's stressful, but I view it as a challenge, and as a result, my body's response allows me to be aroused and focused towards my particular task. But what if I don't feel like I have the resources to meet those demands? What if I reach this stressful event, and instead of thinking, I have these resources and I just have to work really hard, I think, wow, I do not have the resources, I do not know this material, this is beyond me, I don't know what to do. In those cases, our physiological response, as well as our psychological response, produces distraction, stresses us out. This is where we feel like we don't have the skills to meet those challenges. So a lot of how we cope with stress and how we respond to stress has to do with the process of appraisal. Are we appraising this event as a challenge? That is, I can do this and I have the resources necessary to complete this challenge, or I can't do this, this is beyond me. As you can see, the feeling that we can't do things, that we have a threat, actually leads to poorer performance on the same task than if we feel like we do have those resources. So this process of appraisal is really important to understanding our reactions to stress. If you're thinking about a stressor in your life as we talk about this, think about the way that you're appraising that stress. Is this something you feel like you just do not have the resources to attend to? If so, you're probably experiencing this kind of response. Or is it something that you feel like you've got the skills to do, like this course, and that you're just focused on applying all of your skills to achieving those goals? Hans Selye, one of the original researchers on stress, argues that the stress response goes through phases. That is, at first, when we recognize a stressor, we have this alarm reaction where we actually have a dip in our ability to respond to things. It consumes a bunch of resources when we first sort of mobilize our bodies to respond. This is sort of the freezing period where we're mobilizing resources. Immediately afterwards, we tend to go into a phase of stress that Hans calls resistance. So this is where our body's response is actually sort of tuned up. Right? We have that sympathetic nervous system response, and we can respond to the stressors in our life in a much more effective and efficient way. However, if those stressors fail to go away, or if we fail to accomplish our goals and remove those stressors, Selye argues that we move into phase 3, called exhaustion, when our psychological and physiological reserves are depleted, and our resistance to stress decreases pretty dramatically as time goes on. You've probably experienced this. If you've ever been in a sporting event or a long run where at the beginning you feel like every play or every quarter mile is a challenge, you're motivating yourself, you're talking to yourself, you're excited about the challenge, you're really focused and attentive, but the farther along you get, the more tired you get, the fewer resources you have to muster towards your goal, the more hopeless things feel, the more difficult things become when you feel like the reserves are depleted and you move from that challenge state to that threatening state. It's really important to understand that stressors run the gamut of distress and eustress that we talked about earlier, and really importantly, They are not independent of one another, so we can't think about this stress response as a response to only one stressor, but rather all of the different demands on our body simultaneously. These are both good and bad things, like we talked about when we talked about distress and eustress. These are things like catastrophic events, but they're also things like daily hassles. You might have experienced either yourself or your partner or someone else blowing up in the face of some minor daily hassle. Well, it's not because of that individual daily hassle. Instead, it's because that daily hassle pushed them past the point of exhaustion into the experience of threat instead of challenge, where they feel like they don't have the resources to respond and they don't know how to respond appropriately to those stresses. So what do we do in order to move beyond that, and how do we cope with stress? Well, before we talk about coping, one of the things that I'd like to highlight is that constant experiences of stress are actually really detrimental to our physical health. Stress can lead to coronary heart disease from chronic high blood pressure, as demonstrated here. It can clog up our arteries. And we know from lots of empirical research on stress and health that those who are less stressed and who have better appraisals of their stress are more healthy. For example, people who have an optimistic frame, that is, those who approach stressors as challenges rather than threats most of the time, were less likely to develop coronary heart disease than those with a more neutral frame or more pessimistic framework. Similarly, those who were higher stressed were more likely to have colds in another study. And there are lots of reasons why we think this might be the case. For example, if we have persistent stressors and negative emotions, this might lead to two different things. One thing we know it leads to is the release of stress hormones. And the chronic release of these stress hormones, like cortisol, like we talked about in the biological behavior chapter, are related to things like heart disease, suppression of the immune system, which is likely why we have more colds here, and autonomic nervous system effects, things like headaches and hypertension, which lead to chronic heart disease. But persistent stressors not only lead to these physiological changes, but also promote unhealthy behaviors like smoking, drinking, poor nutrition, poor sleep, and other kinds of stress response behaviors that reduce our ability to respond over time and push us towards that point of exhaustion where the real health impacts happen. So this stress and health cycle is a really complicated cycle. Right? So we've got influence from our social cultural forces, we've got influence from the way that we're appraising situations, when you think back to your cognitive chapter, we've got influences from our biology, if you think back to our biological unit, and all of these things are combining to produce a response that is really unhealthy when we think about how chronically stressed most people are. So how do we respond to it? Well, I've talked all along about the differences between perceptions of challenge and perceptions of threat. One of the ways that we can respond to the demands of our modern world is to reconceptualize our stressors as challenges rather than threats. If we can think about the things in our life as things that we have the resources to respond to, or things that we can rely on, a lot of the things your textbook talks about, like social support and other resources that can help us deal with stress, if we can rely on those resources, we can move our appraisal of a situation towards challenge. And then, instead of anxiety, which might promote the increase of making mistakes, we have a decrease in anxiety that promotes clear and focused thinking. Instead of vasoconstriction and high blood pressure, we actually get vasodilation, which is more important for health. It also increases the ability for the brain to get fresh oxygenated blood. Instead of constricted airflow with rapid breathing and sort of panicky breathing where we have lower volume of oxygen, we have bronchodilation where we get more oxygen to the muscles, more oxygen to the brain. And instead of quickly expending our glucose and our blood sugar, we get an increase in glucose production, which is important to increasing energy and helping our brains function better too. In short, the way that we think about our stressors makes a huge difference in the way our body responds to those stressors. And the better we are at thinking about our stressors as challenges, the better we will be at responding to them. So think about a stressor in your life, and then take a few minutes to think about all of the different ways that you have the resources to respond to those demands. Whether it's your personal resources, resources from social support, resources from other sources, You should think about all of the ways that you do have the ability to respond to those things and move that feeling of stress from a feeling of threat to a feeling of challenge. That's going to help you manage your emotions and regulate your emotions, which is the focus of the rest of the chapter. I look forward to hearing your thoughts about motivation, stress, and emotion this unit.